Welcome, everybody. Glad you could join us. I
Yeah.
want to welcome Kipp McMichaels, and he is an extraordinary plant enthusiast, another huge contributor to the Pacific Bulb Society website. Also, his fantastic garden, and he has Calochortus growing his garden, which are amazing. And just the whole construction of his garden is very unique and really wonderfully interesting. I'd like to welcome Kipp and let you take over.
All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Feel free to interrupt me if you've got questions. And of course, there'll also be time for questions at the end.
I have a question. Where are you growing these in your garden? Where's your garden?
My garden is on Ashby Avenue in Berkeley, so at Ashby and Sacramento.
I love your Cal Hort transition there.
I'll do it one more time for everyone's benefit. I'm pretty proud of it.
Yeah, that's so cool.
So
Wow.
it turns out it all fits in the same letter. So how wonderful. All right. So tonight's presentation is the Calochortus of California. It is my favorite genus of native flower. I grew up in Alabama originally, so Calochortus were very far away. When I was really young, Waste Management, the garbage collection service in Alabama, sent a mailer around bragging about how they had environmentally restored a dumping site somewhere in like Montana, and Calochortus lilies had been planted there. So I knew the name from way, way back. And when I moved to California, I started seeing them all over the place and immediately fell in love. So tonight we'll talk about the natural history of Calochortus, go on a photo tour of lots of images that I've taken and some from the internet, and then also talk about growing Calochortus. I have been doing that for about, goodness, 13 years now or so. But for those who have trouble delaying gratification, we can see some eye candy first. The beautiful Calochortus striatus. This is an endangered, critically endangered species. It grows only in alkaline springs in the Mojave Desert. Surprisingly dense in the places where it grows, but definitely a rarity and beautiful.
It's not your garden, obviously.
Yeah. So I'll point out when things are in my garden.
Okay.
You'll probably be able to tell. Yes, so this is Calochortus fimbriatus. It is a Southern California species, or Central California. It goes from the south end of Big Sur to just above Santa Barbara or so. Nice little beetle hitchhiking on the teeple there. This is probably my favorite species in the genus.
Neat.
This is one of the classic species of the genus, Calochortus venustus. You find it almost everywhere you go, one of the more common ones. It has many, many forms, which we'll get to in a little while. Calochortus albus. This is a particularly dwarf form. These plants are about 5 inches tall. This is another sort of classic species, common in the Bay Area, extending north and south, not too far north, but south and east as well, into the mountains and all the way down into Santa Barbara. Maybe not to San Diego, actually. And a little seaside shot of the entrancing Calochortus recurvifolius. This is growing quite literally about 2.5 inches from the edge of the bluff down near San Simeon. I have not visited this particular population in a couple of years, and I'm somewhat trepidatious to go because I imagine some of this cliff has fallen in and they're taking the bulbs with it, unfortunately. Such is the way of nature. And the beautiful Calochortus plumeri. This is a Southern California species, kind of centered around LA, and just another very pretty one. And also feeding a bee right there. All right, the natural history of Calochortus. So I couldn't possibly just do a photo tour. I certainly would like to get sort of centered in the larger knowledge and phylogeny of all of these plants. So we can talk about that. So there's pretty good clarity as far as Calochortus goes in the larger scheme of phylogenetics. So we'll just pop over to Wikipedia to get our start. So here in the angiosperms, the flowering plants, lots of interesting things at the base, kind of fascinating discoveries from the recent decades that the water lilies are very basal to a lot of the angiosperms. And as we pass through the familiar magnoliids, we also then get to the monocots. And so that's where we're interested. That's where we find our Calochortus. So inside the monocots, interesting things, grassy items, pond plants of various kinds with reticulate leaves. It's interesting, many monocots today have parallel venation, but it's clear that various species and even some, basally sitting of the species have reticulate leaves as well. And in fact, Calochortus probably used to have reticulate leaves. Dioscorea, the sweet potato family, is even part of this. Pandanales, screw pines, and then finally we find liliales. So a lot of the familiar plants that we grow in the garden, the amaryllids and the irids, gladiolus, hyacinths, all of those are over in asparagales. Liliales is where we find various things like smilax, a couple of other interesting plants of various kinds, colchicum, tulipa, lots of different genus. All right, so East Asian origins, the Eocene period, we'll get to timelines in a minute, which are kind of all over the place, but Eocene times, say 60 to 40 million years ago or so, East Asia. At this point, the world was a lot warmer than it is now, so you can see there's hardly any ice sitting anywhere. And so even at high latitudes, it probably would have been a very warm climate. For instance, in the Eocene, Oregon had climates that were like Mexico. So tropical, warm across much of the Earth. Just one particular phylogenetic tree from a Patterson and Givnish paper that looked at lily and Calochortus as well. So we can see Lilium up here, which gives this name to the group. And then we move out Fritillary, our familiar Fritillary. So all of these probably arose in Asia, and Fritillary dispersed over into North America. Some interesting plants here. I'll show some pictures in a moment. Erythronium as well. Erythronium may very well have, or rather likely arose in Asia and diversified in North America, though I have heard an interesting theory that it may have diversified in North America and moved backwards into Asia. Tulipa is there as well. Clintonia, a familiar native from California, is there. There's some Asian species too. And then now we find Calochortus. So it's interesting to look here. Don't look too much at this particular box here, Calochortus, Triceratops, Streptopus, Scoliopas, all of those. That particular arrangement is in flux, but generally speaking, you find your Calochortus, and they're closely related to the toad lilies, closely related to Streptopus and Scoliopas, which we just saw, or we just heard about a few minutes ago. All right, so then there's some other interesting parts of the liliales, moving outward from there. So here are some members, some of the more familiar ones. So, classic lily, a Clintonia, again, California native, one of the fritillaries, another California native fritillary. This is a North Illyrian, I believe. Some tulipa, Erythronium, and then here is that toad lily, a surprisingly easy to grow plant, even though it's from sort of moist areas of Asia. Grows pretty well in my backyard with no particular extra summer moisture. And then I believe, this is a Prosartes, maybe a Streptopus, all right. So timelines around the evolution of Calochortus vary a lot. So from that same Patterson and Givnish paper, which I showed the diagram from, they are saying that Calochortus evolved around 7.3 million years ago. From another paper that was a larger census of lily, the larger Liliaceae, we find an estimate of 23 million as an average, but 13 to 32 million or 33 million years ago for Calochortus. That's certainly not the oldest. This is another paper about Liliaceae, and in this one we see much older, that the Calochortoideae, which is not simply just Calochortus, it also includes the Triceratops as well, at least in some phylogenies. We're looking at 57 million years. So ages are all over the place. What I've seen as sort of consensus by a lot of researchers is that they considered Calochortus itself to be a young genus. Make of that what you will. All right, and so then close-up trees for Calochortus are not particularly well resolved. So if you want to look at the closest relatives of Calochortus, it's unclear exactly what those are. So we can see there's a couple of different, these are two different analyses, one of which is a couple of different gene markers, genetic sequences that were looked at. And so in this case, we see that Calochortus is by itself and allied to, at sort of the sibling level to both a clade containing all of the things we mentioned before, Streptopas, Scoliopas, Triceratops, and then all the rest of the Liliae. And then in the other plot here on the right, you see that Calochortus is mixed in a larger group, closest to Triceratops instead, sister to the Streptopas, and then all of those are sister to the rest of the Liliae. So an interesting, variation there. Here's yet another one in which Calochortus is, again, separated from all of them, but Triceratops is completely outside of that grouping, allied more closely with the rest of the plants in the group. This diagram's fairly hard to read, but what's interesting about it is that here, this plot shows Calochortus as not a part of the Streptopas, Scoliopas, Prosartes at all, and in fact, even more removed, so the Calochortus are much closer to the rest of the Liliae. So lots of interesting results these days. Genetics is still all over the place for Calochortus. As I mentioned, a lot of people think that Calochortus is a fairly young genus, and you happen to be sitting in the center of diversity of the genus. This phylogeny is pretty much the best phylogeny we have of Calochortus. It's from about 20 years ago. There was more recently an effort to update this phylogeny and run a better analysis. Unfortunately, that effort failed. So hopefully the scientists will be going back to their original samples and rerunning that analysis. But this one from 20 years ago is still very interesting and has some fascinating insights to the whole group. So formerly, the traditional grouping of Calochortus that we owe to Ownby, sort of a giant of California plants and other plants as well, was a three grouping or a tripartite grouping. That was a section called Calochortus, a section called Mariposa, and a section called Cyclobothra. Those were all based on morphology and other non-genetic analysis measures. And so when the age of genetics came about and we started doing analyses, we found that all of those groupings were, Calochortus actually turns out to be monophyletic, but the rest of them are all mixes and they sort of spread around across the tree. So the grouping from this analysis is much more regional. And so you can see here we have a Bay Area, a Pacific Northwest, San Diego, Great Basin and Rocky Mountains, the Coast Ranges, Southwestern California, and Mexico. So Central Mexico has its own fascinating little clade of plants. I have never seen any of them in person. They are unlike all the rest in their cultivation requirements. So they are a challenge to grow if you try to grow them like the rest of the Calochortus. But we'll get to some details about those in a minute. All right, so here's a map showing that distribution. And so here we are centered in the Bay Area. So if we draw a line out from the Bay Area, all of the ranges overlap except for the Mexico range. And so these are all the different groups of Calochortus. This large, splayed green area is the Macrocarpus group. And so this is a group that has some of the taxa, specifically Macrocarpus itself, have wind-blown seeds. And so obviously the dispersal ability of a lighter wind-blown seed clearly, shows in how widely ranging that taxon is. All right, so Calochortus have grown diverse. There are around 67 or so species in the genus, and the lion's share, around 50 or so of those are in California. They've grown diverse in a variety of ways. One of those is that they are substrate specialists. We find them in interesting and strange substrates and sometimes endemic to those substrates. Peridotite, which is an ultramafic rock, kind of an unusual, deeper crust rock that we rarely see at the surface. This is exposed here at the Cedars up near Occidental, north of the Bay Area. There's a particular genus, a taxon here called Calochortus ratii, which is a yellow plant that specializes on this substrate. Down in the valley that we're looking down here is where you would find that one. Serpentine, the state rock of California, is also another classic substrate for Calochortus. Here we're looking at a hillside in the city of San Luis Obispo. This is a park right in the middle of the city, and there is a little tiny Calochortus obispoensis tucked into the grass there. This is a view of alkaline mud in the Mojave Desert. So this is the site where that picture, where I took the picture of Calochortus striatus earlier. So in the right time of year, of course, this is a flooded puddle of mud. In the drier time of year, it is completely dry and brick hard, and the Calochortus grow at the edge of these pools. Basically, when rains are intense enough, they are in the middle of streams that flow across and over them, and then it slowly dries up during the spring. And Calochortus are also great at very thin and poor soils. So here, this is the very top of Mount Pinos in Kern County. And this is alpine scree, where we can find Calochortus invenustus. And a bit of a tongue-in-cheek substrate specialist here. This is Calochortus venustus popping through pavement in San Benito County. So they're not only beautiful, but they are also tough. All right, so substrate specialists, certainly they are, but that's not the only reason they're diverse. Most likely their kind of hyperdiversity and their extreme diversity in California derives just as much from an interesting mix of genetics and pollinators and the various substrate tolerances that they have. So this is a really interesting set of diagrams. So this is taking the diagram we looked at earlier that created those geographic clades, and this is mapping other kinds of details onto them. So on the left here, still the geographic clades, slightly different, but in this case, we're talking about they've chosen mountain ranges instead of larger geographic areas. So these are the mountain ranges these species are associated to or found in. Then we have base chromosome number. So base chromosome number is what determines whether plants can interbreed or not. So one of the strategies that seems to be allowing Calochortus to radiate like they do is that they can change their chromosome number even within the same sort of groupings. And it's called doubling up in literature, which means that you can have, say, for instance, here we have Calochortus ambiguus and Calochortus gunnissonii. Can everyone see my mouse pointer, or is that not the case?
Yep, you're moving
Okay.
fast, but
Okay, great. You can't see it? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Just wanted to make sure. Want to make sure you know where I'm pointing. All right, so so here, we can look and see Calochortus ambiguus, gunnissonii, and nutalii. They, even though they are otherwise fairly closely related, can coexist in the same environments and not interbreed, and hence lose the distinction between those species by the change in the chromosome number, which took place here. And likewise, if we were to plot these taxa with their locations looking back towards the left, we could see that in many cases, you have a mixture of chromosome numbers that allows multiple Calochortus taxa to grow in the exact same places. And that's, there are spots where I've gone that 5 different species grow in the same location, at slightly different times or in slightly different, specialized niches, but, within the same, say, 10 or 15 foot area. All right, so serpentine tolerance, you can also see here, has evolved multiple times. Serpentine tolerance is shorthand for a variety of ultramafic tolerances as well. It's not just serpentine. And then floral syndrome is probably the most fascinating part. So Ownby, who is sort of the originator of the old way of categorizing Calochortus, relied a lot on the shape of flowers and the shape of other parts of the plant, which seemed to make sense. Tulip-shaped flowers would seem to be alike, and the fairy lanterns would seem to be alike. Various other kinds of plants along those lines. We'll get to some pictures of the different kinds of Calochortus in just a moment. But as we did a genetic analysis and looked at the different, kinds of the organization of the different sort of flowers that came out of that, we realized that Calochortus is a very flexible genus, and that upright bloomers have shifted to bowed flowers, and likewise, furry flowers, which are full of little hairs, have lost those and gained them over time. So there's lots of passing of traits around the genus. And so one can't simply assume that because the flowers have a similar form, they're actually very closely related at all. Rather fascinating. And what you might expect from a young genus, which is rapidly radiating out across the West. All right, so Calochortus also have pollinators, and in studies of Calochortus in relation to other plants around them, Calochortus tend to be the most diverse in terms of all of the different kinds of pollinators they attract. So here we can see beetles inside a Calochortus superbus, bees inside a Calochortus venustus. These can be sites, usually almost always are sites of feeding, but they are also sites of mating. And animals will also, bugs will also just overnight in flowers because the flowers will tend to curl up and close in the evening. Okay. Some perhaps wasps, perhaps flies. I'm not exactly sure what these tiny insects are. This pair of Calochortus clavatus has multiple different kinds of beetles and a bee inside it. So another theory about what allows Calochortus to be hyper-specious in California is its seeds don't disperse very well. So I mentioned earlier macrocarpus is distinctive because it has wind-dispersed seeds. The rest of Calochortus don't have wind-dispersed seeds. Their seeds don't offer any sort of plant or rather of animal reward that might cause, say, ants or something else to gather them and move them around. And they don't have any particular modifications or adaptations to catch on to things, at least as far as we know. So it's unclear, how far a given plant can spread its seeds, generally speaking. Calochortus tolmii here not only has very small and fairly heavy seeds, and that's true of most of the Calochortus, their seeds are fairly small and heavy, but its seed pods also point down and in fact curl down towards the substrate after the plant flowers. So in most cases, the farthest some of these seeds are going to travel is, perhaps a few inches from the mother plant. These are Calochortus leclinii seeds. This is a higher elevation taxon. It's a little more towards the Big Basin area. And so it looks like it may be evolving more of a wind dispersed seed. It certainly has a little more surface area here. But on the other hand, even though the theory is that Calochortus are poor at dispersing themselves, what's interesting is that Calochortus can get around quite well. So here's just a couple of Jepson herbarium specimen listings from across the state. On the left, Calochortus invenustus is interesting because all of these dots, unlike the Calochortus splendens and the Calochortus albus that we're looking at, which are fairly mesic spots, low elevation, close to sea level, all the way up to several thousand feet, 4,000 or 5,000 feet in some cases. Calochortus invenustus is found pretty restrictively at the tops of mountains. You rarely find it, more than maybe a couple of hundred feet below the summit of mountains when you do find it. And so clearly something is allowing this to move around because the distribution in the Bay Area is just a few spots, either at the tops of fairly tall mountains or in rain shadows at the tops of hills. And so something is allowing these seeds to spread between the areas, and I don't know what it is. Likewise, Calochortus splendens, we find that all the way into Mexico. The Jepson ends at the border, but of course it extends down into Mexico. You can find it all the way into Mexico and all the way up east of Arcata, at least historically. There's a particular serpentine outcrop there where it grew. So these plants are clearly able to move around. Calochortus albus is another one of the fairy lantern forms. Its seed pods dangle downwards and spill their seeds directly, they drop directly to the ground. And so even that taxon is able to move around and has got quite a large range in the state. I imagine many people are here for pretty pictures, and so we can get those started in earnest now. So Calochortus have a lot of different groupings. I mentioned some of Ownby's stuff. There's also the larger geographic groupings I also talked about. I came up with a little informal grouping just for the purposes of this talk, particularly to feature the venustus, which are just fascinating. So I'll get started. So we'll start off with fairy lanterns. Fairy lanterns are the dangling flowers. So this is a picture of my garden. And at the center here is Calochortus aminus. It is a southern sea aran species in the foothills. A little chandelier of pink petals, kind of hairy on the inside. Calochortus pulchellus, an endemic to Mount Diablo and the areas just around Mount Diablo, extends a little bit. You can find it in Morgan territory as well. I mean, not Morgan territory, you also can find it in Morgan territory, but Briones, for instance, you can also find it there, but not too far away from Mount Diablo. Now, look closely at this one because the next one is awfully similar. So this is Calochortus amabilis, very similar. I'll move back and forth between the two. The distinction here are the tepals. The tepals tend to be straight out, almost like a little hat in amabilis, and they tend to curve around the blossom. And pulchellus also tends to have more globular flowers whereas amabilis is fairly open petaled and rather square or cubical in shape, but they are very similar and their ranges come very, very close. They do, however, in genetic analyses, they are separate. So they're not actually sister taxa to each other in the genetic analysis. Older flowers of amabilis can take on a wonderful rusty orange color, so quite nice there. Here's Calochortus albus again. This is sort of the classic fairy lantern. One could imagine that all the rest of the fairy lanterns are just colored versions of albus. It's not true, but one could imagine that, and scientists did for quite some time. Calochortus albus is variable across its range, and it goes from the Sierra to the Bay Area all the way down to San Diego. As you move south from the Bay Area, things get pinker and pinker. This is one from Old Coast Road down near Big Sur. You can see the seed capsule there from some of the older blossoms. And then this is the wonderful Calochortus albus rubellus. This is a population that is centered down near Cambria and Atascadero. And the redness of these flowers is sort of darkest in that area, but it radiates outward. So, as you move down through Big Sur and the inland coast range, you find pinker and pinker flowers. Even at the center of its distribution, however, you find darkest red flowers like this one, deep wine red flowers right next to white flowers, right next to, pink flowers that are halfway in between the two shades. So there's still a lot of variation in the shades there. There's not a saturated locus of color, but nonetheless, you can find some wonderful ones in that area. All right, fascinating fuzz. So lots of Calochortus are full of little whiskers, little fuzzy growths that can sometimes even fill the blossom. So this is Calochortus uniflorus. It is found all around the Bay Area and well north and well south of the Bay Area. It specializes in usually wet areas, so seeps, wet meadows. This one is actually at the edge of a completely flooded field north of the Bay Area near Bear Creek Road. This is the seed pod of Calochortus uniflorus. So after that upright flower finishes its bloom, the stem curls down and almost seems to try to corkscrew itself into the ground. And then the seed pod will pop open and seeds will pop out. The seeds are not especially mobile, as you can see. And this population is actually well south of the Bay Area down near San Simeon. So over near Point Reyes, we have the beautiful Calochortus tolmii, just a wonderful, ultra furry, wonderfully purple taxon. This area, which is near Abbott's Lagoon in Point Reyes, a particular hilltop, is just thick with these. In a good year, which this is probably a good year, and this is a good time to go. I encourage you to head in that direction. There are probably tens of thousands of them blooming. It can be quite spectacular there. A close relative of Calochortus tolmii is Calochortus ceruleus. This one's from up in the Sierra. Ceruleus is the genus. It is not always so blue purple. However, it might be called. In this case, this was a very pale version of it. The whole population of these I found were extremely diminutive and very pale. This was up in the Sierra off of Highway 8, I believe. And this is wonderful Calochortus splendens. Calochortus splendens you can find, I showed the distribution, from far north in the state all the way down to Mexico as well. It is a variable taxon. So there is theory that there's another taxon hidden within Calochortus splendens called Calochortus davidsonianus. And here's an example of what one might call davidsonianus. You can see the differences here of, a pale flower kind of full of long white hairs that congest the flower. And davidsonianus is a much darker flower, darker anthers, and very uncongested with very short hairs. Now, at one point when I was giving presentations around Calochortus and doing my own research, I was convinced that davidsonianus did seem distinct. My experience, finding it and stuff. However, since then, I have seen much more many more populations of Calochortus splendens. And while there are certainly distinctions that can be made between Davidsonianus and splendens on a flower by flower basis, looking at the populations I've seen, they grade into one another pretty effectively. And on top of that, you find Calochortus davidsonianus in San Diego, and you also find this picture is an example from north of the Bay Area near Walker Ridge. So definitely mixed in all over its range with the traditional Calochortus splendens. So these days, I am not as convinced that Calochortus davidsonianus is a distinct taxon. But splendens is still nonetheless wonderful. Probably the longest hairs of all of the taxon, or at least the ones that I've seen close up. Calochortus clavatus is another wonderful plant, spread around the state, has various forms, and gets its name from the clavate hairs. So its hairs have, and this is one of the var avius, which is from up in the Sierra foothills, an isolated population, a distinct taxon, subspecies and isolated in the Sierra. Here we go. So the clavate hair. So this is Calochortus clavatus clavatus, and the tips of the hairs in clavatus are clavate. They're like a little hammer. So they have a bulb, bulbous at the end. So Calochortus clavatus is the sort of base taxon, and this is a very short version of Calochortus clavatus. I include that in the listing to compare it with Calochortus clavatus recurvifolius. So this is a purported different subspecies that grows in a few places near the coast and serpentine clay. Very close to this population, however, is the dwarf Calochortus. That is a strikingly similar plant. So I'm also skeptical these days that recurvifolius is a distinct taxon. I think it's just a few populations at the edge of the distribution that have particularly small size. But again, this one that I'm showing here is about 40 miles away on closer to Atascadero, and it is no taller, has this sort of same proportions as the seaside Clavatus recurvifolius. But Clavatus recurvifolius is beautiful, wonderful taxon. These purple, deep purple anthers inside that rusty golden chalice. And extremely, extremely short. So these plants are usually about 2 inches off of the ground. One of the most unusual of the taxon in Calochortus is Calochortus obispoensis. It is an endemic to San Luis Obispo County on Serpentine, and it is basically a plant that's abandoned nearly all, or a flower that's abandoned nearly all of its parts except for the hairs. We still have the reproductive parts, but the petals are severely reduced, and what's left of them are just covered with these little whiskery hairs. This is a very small plant in all ways. The bulbs are actually fairly normal sized for compared to other taxon as well, but the foliage, the flowers, the seed pods, all very, very small. But a captivating flower nonetheless. Calochortus weedii comes from San Diego and the areas around, and extends north, into LA County as well, and south into Mexico. So there are various groupings of weedii. There's weedii, weedii pallidus, weedii intermedius. There used to be weedii nortieri, which is now a different taxon called Cambriatus, which we'll get to. Weedii pretty much grade smoothly between all of those different forms. So they can be called subspecies, but they're not distinctive except just where you happen to find a flower. You can say that that's one subspecies or another, but it's not necessarily a grouping in a natural sense. It's just a morphological grouping. So Calochortus, so this is sort of the classic weedii. This is weedii. Weedii would be called that. Very golden, rust-colored speckles and lots of hairs. Some forms have a wonderful coloration, deep rust rims. Some of the petals can be solid. There's a lot of variation there. This is weedii intermedius. This is a shot from my yard. Weedii intermedius is sort of halfway in between weedii and plummeri. And that's Calochortus plummeri. It is a wonderful plant, very large. Typically the plants I encounter are at minimum 3 feet tall, and as often as not, 5 to 6 feet tall. Threading up through bushes and chaparral. These are from the hills in Santa Monica Mountains. beautiful, beautiful flower. The intensity of these petals can be amazing. I've seen pictures of solid, deep red petals and sort of everything in between with this nice little sort of splotchy fade to white on lots of them. Just one of the most picturesque of the taxon. Calochortus tiburonensis I would be severely remiss if I didn't mention this one. So this one's our local hyper-endemic, maybe one of the rarest flowering plants in the whole world because of that. It only grows on Tiburon. It only grows in a particular couple of protected areas, serpentine outcrops on Tiburon. Fascinating plant. This gave Ownby, the original taxonomist, great trouble in trying to understand how it allied with the rest. It's a mixture of features that would make it seem like it's a hybrid of many things, though genetic analysis makes it appear as if it's just a local plant that happens to have gotten very strange in Tiburon. Absolutely beautiful, full of hairs, and no flower is the same. There's rings and rust coloreds and oranges and darker browns. It's just an amazingly diverse little plant, and wasn't discovered until the late 1970s, I believe. It blooms late enough in the year that most of the surroundings are dead and not especially floriferous, and the flowers themselves blend right in with those kinds of colors, so it was not noticed. All right, and here's my favorite, Calochortus fimbriatus. We'll start with a rather sedate, plain-looking one. So this is a taxon from around Santa Barbara or so, southern Big Sur. There's a couple of populations there, and then down into Santa Barbara County. Just a beautiful, beautiful plant. Also really large, a close relative of the rest of the weedii. It used to be a subspecies, considered a subspecies of weedii. Close relative of plumberi, but beautiful in its own right. Like plumberi, you can find petals that are a solid, almost black color in certain plants. Many of them have this splotchiness with a, kind of highlighted edge to the petals with just beautiful splotches and colorations. This is a picture from one of the ones in my yard. So many Calochortus, sort of the classic Calochortus is the Mariposa, a chalice that looks like, a three-winged butterfly. There's so many different ones, so many different patterns. This is Calochortus leclinii. This grows up at elevation in the Sierra. This is a rather rare plant, Calochortus dunni. It only grows in a few spots down in Southern California and I believe Western Arizona. I'm not sure for a fact it extends there, but I think it's thought that it does. Calochortus luteus. Calochortus luteus is probably the most familiar of the Calochortus to many people. They may not have even realized they were looking at luteus when they were looking at a field of luteus. At times, it can look a lot like a poppy if you're not looking at it closely, or like a tidy tip or one of the other common wildflowers. This is from a dwarf population down near San Simeon. That same population has a variety of different kinds of color patterns and variations. So here's a really, really pale version. This one was barely yellow. Here's a wonderful little conglomeration of Calochortus and Brodia terrestris. This is out near Piscines. So this is actually a shot from a stand that if we choose to go to Piscines Road for the Calochortus field trip, I'm going to be taking people on. We might be able to see this same stand again this year. Calochortus palmeri. So this one's from the mountains in sort of Southern California. You can find it starting in San Luis Obispo County and southward. It likes wet areas for the most part, streams and seeps. Calochortus simulans. This one has particularly nicely marked tepals. This one is, a relative of Venustus. Many people consider it very much like Venustus, but it is distinct in form and in genetics. Calochortus superbus, a local Bay Area. This is from near Lake Berryessa. If we go on the Lake Berryessa route for the Calochortus field trip that I'm going to be taking people on, we might see this taxon. There's another superbus. For whatever reason, my camera decided to make only the blossom in color when I took this picture. It wasn't actually a purposeful effect, and the surroundings were not as gray as they appear, but nonetheless a nice highlight. Another shot of Superbus. Superbus just has an endless array of internal markings, and you can find deeply colored, jewel tone flowers in various places as well. Calochortus invenustus, which we've mentioned, here in a serpentine outcrop east of the Bay Area. I was surprised a few years ago when this location started popping up on iNaturalist and in the Jepson. I had always experienced invenustus as a high elevation, above 6,000 or 7,000 feet in the mountains in Southern California. And this is a population that's at only a few thousand feet in dry serpentine east of San Jose up in the hills. Invenustus actually means not very pretty. Venustus is pretty, and invenustus is not very pretty, but it can actually be quite pretty. And probably the most dazzling flower of the genus, dazzling mariposa of the genus, is Calochortus cannedii. Pictures don't do justice to the orange, the vibrant, vermilion, glowing orange of these flowers. Here's a shot from my garden. This is a bit of a humble brag. This is an extremely difficult taxon to grow, and it managed to bloom in the wettest year that we've had in quite a while last year. So apparently it can handle a good bit of moisture. I'll talk more about moisture tolerance in Calochortus when we get to the gardening section. But I could show so many pictures of cannedii, so many versions of just that glorious, glowing orange. It radiates out from the landscape. I've been stopped, it's caught my eye going 60 miles an hour down a road in Central California. It's just that vibrant. All right, now Calochortus cannedii is certainly vibrant, but Calochortus venustus rivals it in almost every way. So Calochortus venustus is all over the state. You'll find it in many places around the Bay Area. As you go south, you find it as well. In certain places, it has more color than others, but in almost every place, you can find a mixture of both whites, as you see here, even yellows, which is an unusual color for venustus. All the rest of the colors are not so unusual, but the yellow is fairly unusual for venustus. This is another shot from the Griswold Hills. So this is another potential spot we could go to if we take the Piscenes route for the Calochortus field trip. And the blooms can have varying amounts of color. They're not restricted to white splotches. The color is in every possible variant shade of red and purple and pink and orange. Orange is another fairly rare color. The patterns can be dazzling. This little psychedelic wonder here from Mount Pinos. Another one from that same population. Just wonderful. So many shades of red, pure reds, purple reds, brick reds. Deep purples, magentas, fascinating little, fades and stripes, purples, and just sumptuous velvety reds. These flowers are just amazing to behold in person. They simultaneously radiate red light and swallow it into blackness as well. It's just wonderful. And there are many other taxa. Now, this is where the limits of my travels are apparent. I don't have pictures of these. They extend outside California and outside of the US as well. So we'll go to the Pacific Bulb Society for a few images. So this is Calochortus spatulatus from Mexico, a fascinating little, what we would call a fairy lantern, though not evolved from the fairy lanterns at all. Another Mexican species, Calochortus barbatus. You can see how these are definitely redolent of the Calochortus weedii that we were looking at earlier, but again, not very closely related. Because of this similarity, Ownby, amongst others, thought that they were closely related, but genetics says otherwise. And from Mexico, we move up to Northern California and Oregon. And so there's a whole center of diversity in Northern California and Oregon around cat's ears. So furry flowers full of color and hairs. So this is Calochortus cacti from Oregon. Just a beautiful, beautiful plant. specializing in serpentine soils in Oregon. There's a whole, in Josephine County and close areas around there, there's a lot of serpentine in the landscape. And so tons of Calochortus have diversified and speciated in that area. Take a look at a few more of the Mexican taxon as well. So here's another one, a fairly simple little plant growing in moist areas. And back to the Great Plains, the beautiful Calochortus nutalii. This is a particularly color intense version. It can vary from white with some pretty stripes down at the bottom to these pinks and oranges and yellows. And Calochortus greeni from northeastern California and the Great Basin near there. Beautiful pink, growing in moist areas. All right, so growing Calochortus. Calochortus are pretty easy to grow, but they do have particular requirements, so it's important to be aware of them. They do have requirements that go against a lot of typical garden plants. Even though Calochortus are made available by the sort of typical bulb Dutch growers as spring plants, usually annuals, they aren't really, for the most part, aren't simply spring plants. They're more fall, Mediterranean winter growing plants in most cases. So fall and winter sowing is important if you're growing from seed, and I encourage you to grow from seed. All the species want moisture for germination and for their seedling season. That seedling season, depending on taxon, can be all year and barely going dormant before the next moisture regime starts. It can also be, short for some of the drier growing species. All of the plants in my experience, and I've grown stuff from the deserts in Southern California, from the mountains in Northern California, all of them appreciate a long, moist spring, a long, cool, moist spring. Warm temperatures, even with moisture available, will trigger premature dormancy. The plants are very sensitive to perceiving that summer is upon them and that they need to start pulling in their resources and going dormant. Pots work. You can grow Calochortus effectively in pots, but it is difficult. There's a number of reasons for that. They have large root runs in some cases. The bulbs dig themselves very deep. Year over year, they will pull themselves further and further into the pot. And as they get close to your drain holes, they will experience much more aridity than they're expecting. And that will trigger them to basically be either perpetually dormant or to never do much more than throw up the tiniest blade before going dormant again. Substrate drainage is really more important than hard growing. Many people, are of the opinion that you should grow Calochortus with, as little moisture as possible during the summer, with as few nutrients. I don't find that to be the case. Good drainage allows for success in really moist conditions, and I can talk about that in a minute. Also in nature, the places where we find Calochortus can certainly be moisture rich. They appreciate fertilizer as well. They will be at their happiest if they're replanted every 2 years. They will bloom proliferously and bulbiferously as well if given good nutrients and fresh soil. And you don't have to worry about their exotic substrates. The ones that grow in serpentine or peridotite or granite scree or other kinds of things, those never seem to have any problem growing in a standard garden mixture. So my garden mixture, just to share, is 1 part granite, decomposed granite, 1 part sand, 1 part pumice, and 1 part whatever potting soil happens to be available at the time, usually some kind of, humusy, composty mix. So a rather mineral-rich substrate for myself. If you look up Calochortus substrates, and the Calochortus book by Gerritsen and Parsons has a couple of references for different soil mixes. The soil mixes run the gamut from very peaty soil mixes to pure sand. So Calochortus are quite flexible. So summer water. Most people would say summer water is a no-no for Calochortus. I do not find that to be the case. So here's some images from my garden. This is Calochortus albus var rubellus. This plant had about 55 flowers on it, which for Calochortus is extremely high. You can see a Calochortus amminus in the left back there. And this plant grows in my front yard. My front yard is that same rocky substrate I mentioned before, but I water this between weekly and bi-weekly, or once a week or once every 2 weeks during the summer. And these plants were no worse for their wear. Not just these plants. Calochortus albus rubellus is, from the mountains near the coast in Santa Barbara, sorry, not Santa Barbara County, in San Luis Obispo County. And it, kind of is from a place where it would receive more moisture. It's shady conditions, usually on little ravines, in moisture areas. But even the Southern California species that you most often find in extremely dry places, inland from the coast, those also seem to have no problem with the summer irrigation. I am suspicious that humans have probably stolen all of the best growing sites from Calochortus. And the reason that we tend to find them at the tops of mountains and in other, and only in certain serpentine outcrops is not because that's the only place they can grow or that they want to grow. It's that that's the only place where they've survived. So that would indicate then that you can probably give them more nutrients and more moisture than is typically suggested. Even the arid adapted species, the ones from the driest parts of their range, experience the summer monsoons. So they can certainly handle warm season moisture. And as I mentioned, ridgetop populations may be there for moisture. The populations I found in Southern California of various weedii and fimbriatus species, they certainly are in places where coastal fog is probably keeping them moist during a lot of the summer. All right, so Calochortus are tasty. Both Native Americans and rodents love them. So definitely when you're growing them, that can be a problem. Caterpillars can be a problem, especially the small green caterpillars that like to sort of knit together the leaves of the plants, of all kinds of plants. I find them in my succulents, I find them in my Calochortus. They're particularly problematic for Calochortus because they love to attack developing buds and sort of the meristem that's forming into buds. So they can easily, with, eating a quarter inch of a stem, they can manage to take out all of the blooms that are going to be produced that year. So definitely something to watch out for if you are growing them. As I mentioned, they are edible to humans. I've never grown enough to consider consuming any of them, but they are apparently much like onions as far as that goes. That is the extent of my show. We can certainly open it up to questions and discussion. I have tons of pictures that I can share if people would like to see more pictures of more Calochortus. We can also just talk about Calochortus more generally. What would people like to do?
Kipp, that was eye candy and informational and wonderful. We can talk about field trip maybe a little bit.
Yes, that sounds great. So there's two options for field trips. One option for a field trip would be to go south of San Jose, head south on 25. We could head south on 25 to go down south of Hollister and go through Piscines. So Piscines Road is a paved road. It ends up becoming a dirt road, but it's a paved road. It goes out east from south of Hollister, and eventually, if you take it all the way, you can take it all the way to I-5. This drive, it's a long drive, but we pass multiple different populations. All right, so here's lots of pictures. I mentioned I pulled together for the talk. Some of these are in the talk itself. Some of these were just gathered together, but there are wonderful populations. Let me see. Where are you? Here we go. So yeah, so this is another field in that same drive, just a huge tens of thousands of Calochortus luteus across the hillside. So very nice stuff there. This is also one we could find. So this is argilosus, beautifully colored argilosus on that same drive.
What are we talking about for timing on this? What, like April, March?
Yeah. So the day is set for this field trip. So we have two
Okay.
options. So we can do this one, which is a Piscines. The day is May the 26th.
Okay.
My schedule is packed around this time. I have weddings and out of town travels. The 26th is the only day I can do, and unfortunately, I'm booked up on the weekends around it, and May the 26th is the latest we would want to go for many of these taxa. So the Bay Area has, as I mentioned, we're at the center of diversity, and there's an amazing number of taxa to be seen. But being the center of diversity, there's lots of different species and lots of different bloom times. So it's difficult to find one time to see, you can't find one time to see all the species you might be able to catch. And further afield, San Luis Obispo County, for instance, has more taxa to see at one time, but that's of course
Wow.
much too far away for us to go. Though I have hosted travel road trip versions of this tour down there in the past.
That big field of yellow luteus, was that, do you remember what time of year you took that picture?
Yeah, so that's like
That-
May 15th or so. So we'll be right
okay.
on time. Yeah, so
Okay.
it'll be perfectly timed as far as that goes. Yeah, so this is another further east in the Griswold Hills. So this is an extremely dry area, but in a good rain year, you have an amazing selection of flowers. So this is another stand. So this is Calochortus venustus here. There's also another Calochortus you can see in the background here, some blurry spots, which are Calochortus clavatus. This is a beautiful area as well, just a mix of delphiniums and castanea and so many other things.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Wonderful photo. Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Flower too.
Thanks. So this presentation is partially also an example of the improvements in digital photography. I can only claim so much in the way of some of these photos because I'm taking photos just like I used to with varying levels of overexposure, but the cameras have gotten a lot better these days.
Great.
Yeah, so wonderful things to see in Piscines. So the Lake Berryessa route, the west side of Lake Berryessa. So let me go back to Google Maps. So the Piscines route is definitely an all-day affair. We probably want to, like meet in the morning in Hollister and then go from there. That one does have some interesting options. We could find ourselves driving through the Clear Creek Wilderness, which has some really amazing examples of venustus, but it is also a controlled area because there's asbestos in the soil. So we can talk about details. Apparently it's not quote unquote dangerous asbestos, but your mileage may vary. So we can consider that if we choose that route. So the other route is a route north of the Bay Area, up the west side of Lake Berryessa. So this one would come through Suisun, getting off of I-80 in Suisun and then making our way up various highways and stuff to the western side of Lake Berryessa. For that one, we would get to see, let's see here, we would get to see Amabilis. So Amabilis would be one of the ones we could see there. Some quite nice that. That same route has some amazing lupin stands as well. So if we time it right, there's some places where their fields are just full of blue with lupin, quite wonderful. Superbus is another one that we could catch on that route. And also Uniflorus. Let me see. Okay, yeah, so Uniflorus as well. We could also find yellow Superbus, more luteus. And in addition to that one, that timing would be pretty good for ending that trip by going through Bear Valley, which is an amazing wildflower area, arid rain shadow wildflower valley north of Lake Berryessa. So that would be so both of these trips would be the kind of thing where we'd probably meet in the morning. It would be a several hours long trip, and then there would be several hours of finding your way back home again at the end of it. Unfortunately, the immediate Bay Area is just a little too densely packed. We can certainly see, so if neither of these options work, there are other options to see just a few taxa, closer in or in a shorter single route. But these are the two options I think are the sort of the most worth the effort and the time.
Those sound wonderful. My thought is I can go to the ones in the Bay Area anytime. And these other longer, far afield, it'd be great to have someone showing us the way. I'm torn. But
Yeah,
it sound great.
And there's certainly more to see than just Calochortus. There's lots of other geophytes. The time that we would be going, which is in late May, obviously many things have started to dry up. So a lot of the annuals are much less apparent in the landscape at that point, but there are a lot of geophytes and a lot of the hardier, bushier annuals or bushier perennials that are still in bloom. So
how is Bear Valley that time of year? Late May.
Bear Valley can be pretty spectacular. Bear Valley really goes off in mid-April or so, so we'd still be a little bit early for kind of the maximum of the bloom, but depending on the year, there can be quite a large variation. And I've seen, just a painted landscape of every color you can imagine there. So obviously weather and rain patterns are unpredictable, so we can't know exactly, but this does seem to be similar to last year, and last year was certainly a good year for Bear Valley.
Okay, well, if people want to put what they want in the chat, we can help the, take that into consideration.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
Always
So,
could go down to Hollister the night before or something if they want as well.
yeah. So the Berryessa route is moderately shorter. However, there are fewer taxa to see. The Piscenes route is longer, but there are certainly larger stands, more impressive populations of various plants to see. And for people who are especially motivated, we could tack on even more extensive, options on the route. So
Wonderful. Okay. I want to go to both. Maybe you can give us well, you kind of gave us the routes already, so that's great. Thank you. And you had mentioned that Briones, where would you suggest going to Briones?
So Briones,
That we can go on our own.
yeah, definitely. So Briones, you can start, let's see here, the Blue Oak Trailhead, Rayleigh Valley Trailhead, or the Blue Oak Trailhead, depending. It's not easy to get to the Blue Oak Trail. So Rayleigh Valley is where you'd want to go. You can take the Blue Oak Trail, and the Blue Oak Trail then comes all the way up, and there's this large loop trail that goes all around Briones. On this trail, there is Calochortus argilosus, Calochortus pulchellus, and Calochortus luteus at various places. If anybody wants to, I can send you, better instructions and some map drop points for those things. But yeah, there's at least 3 taxa there. You may be able to find albus there. It's potentially there. I have not seen it there myself, but there's definitely pulchellus, luteus, and argilosus.
Wonderful. Okay. Yeah, I've seen Puchella up there, but that's about it. But
Yeah. The pulchellus grows right at the middle of the walking path in some places, Briones. So that's pretty interesting.
okay.
And what's the timing for going to Briones? Is it also late May?
So Briones, so pulchellus is one of the earlier blooming. So yeah, so May is a great time to go to Briones, or if you want to catch pulchellus sort of at its, in its most grand, go to Mount Diablo.
The one out in Clayton you're talking about?
Yeah. So it's
Mitchell Canyon.
Mitchell Canyon. There we go. Yeah. So Mitchell Canyon. The Mitchell Canyon Trail is the best place to see pulchellus. You have amazing plants there. It's a nice shaded area, so you can see just a really good population there. So that's a great place for pulchellus. Mount Diablo also has venustus and argilosus, so you can see some nice ones there. And there's actually also splendens at Mount Diablo. Yeah, Diablo, but it is in a spot where it's not close to trails and difficult to get to.
Mhm.
And
would that also be late May?
So late May for the pulchellus. The argilosus extends into, can extend into June even. And the splendens can go even longer than that, especially in a good rain year. But again, it's one of the hard ones to find on Mount Diablo.
Thanks, Kipp.
the Mitchell Canyon Trail is a great trail because you start by the creek where the pulchellus is, and then you go up into Chaparral where there's lost the plant, but there's like wind poppies down by the below, but lots of chaparral plants, which are great.
Yeah. There's ceanothus. There's nice soap plant up there. There's neat variegated soap plant on Mount Diablo. There's all kinds of fun stuff to see there.
Yeah, it's a great trail.
So another option, that we could take would be going out Livermore, out Mines Road, which is here, goes sort of straight south from Livermore, goes near Del Val. And then you can come around and either head out to I-5 again or back over Mount Hamilton. Either way works. And that one has just a couple of taxon. We could see venustus there, and we could see invenustus there. might be able to catch an albus or, one of the others. But so I chose the routes I chose because of the density of the different taxa to see, but there are certainly other options. And if people want directions for some nice Calochortus drives, you can certainly contact me and I can give you some pointers.
That's great. Awesome. That's wonderful, Kipp. Thank you so much for all the beautiful pictures and all the information. It's great.
You're quite welcome. And if anybody, I generally have seed of various taxa available, not now, but in the fall, late summer and fall. So if people are interested in trying some Calochortus from seed, I've donated some of last year's seed to the seed exchange. But if you are interested and didn't get any from the seed exchange, let me know.
Oh, terrific.
Just one mention, so there, I saw the chat, somebody wanted to know a repeat of your soil mix.
Oh yeah, so my soil mix is 1 part decomposed granite, 1 part pumice, 1 part sand, and 1 part potting soil. I like the ultra potting mix from American Soil and Stone in Richmond, but I've used various other. What you want is something that doesn't have a lot of like wood chips and other things, a composty a composty mix, but not a lot of wood chips. Minerally mix as well. But pretty much any kind of soil will do. And with the mix being mostly rock and sand, the organic stuff after a couple of years washes out anyway. So you're left with an extremely well-draining substrate. The bulbs will persist in that and grow happily, but they really appreciate fresh soil every 2 years, every 3 years. If you go 4 years, they're going to start really sulking and declining. So yeah, they like heavy feeding if you can give it to them, and and good moisture.
So do you just put the soil on the top when you're refreshing the soil?
So the nice thing, so Calochortus regenerate their bulb every year. So last year's bulb puts all of its energy into making the leaf and the flowers of this year, and then next year's bulb is generated as a new bulb. They're pretty easy to repot just whole cloth. You're not really going to disturb roots. So at the end of the season, they're completely dormant, they're rootless. So you can just take them out and put them in brand new dirt.
So you dig them up and then.
Yeah. Well, now when you plant them in the ground, you don't have to really worry about that as much. So a top dressing, or fertilizer is fine. They tend to do really well in the ground. In pots, you definitely want to refresh the soil every couple of years.
Okay, yeah. And then someone asked, how deep should the soil mix be?
As deep as you can make it. A 2-foot deep pot would not be too deep for Calochortus.
Wow.
And sorry, I was not looking at the chat while I was talking, so I'm looking at the chat now. Yeah, feel free to send me something that you might think might be Venustus. Venustus is extremely variable, but it also is a lookalike for argilosis in certain places. So they have similar requirements though.
Carrie Olson asks, so they don't pup new bulbs?
So it depends on the taxon. So the fairy lanterns, some of those are bulbiferous. They will make bulbils in their stems. Amabilis is also bulbiferous. It's pretty reliably bulbiferous. Venustus is argilosis. So a lot of those, if they've had a good year, in addition to making a leaf and making a stem at the base of the largest leaf, and sometimes on some of the smaller cauline leaves on the stem, they will make little bulbils. So here's a tip. If you find a population of Venustus and you love the plants, but you're not there at the time of seed, you can pull 1 flower stem out, and obviously only do this in places with giant populations. Be a good steward of the natural environment, but you can pull the flower stem out, and generally there'll be a bulbil at the base of the flower stem. If you pop any spent or unspent blooms off of the top of that stem, but leave the stem intact with the bulbil attached to it, it will soak up all the nutrients stored in the stem, and you can go from a bulbil the size of a grain of rice to a bulbil the size of a chickpea to get started on next year's growth. That's also a really great way of cloning plants. So one of the amazing things about Venustus is you find them in places where, as I showed in those pictures, this one plant has this amazing pattern of flowers. You would never want to dig that plant up and steal the genetics from the local population. And even seeds can be difficult, to get sort of a similar plant. But if you pop the bloom stem up, it doesn't harm the bulb at all. And it will often provide a bulbil. So that is a way for you to clone your plants. I also plant the bulbils from my plants in cultivation as well. So bulbils are great, and many of the taxon have them. Some of the most interesting taxon, like the weedy eye and stuff, don't tend to be very bulbiferous. But there's also reports that happier plants will spontaneously be bulbiferous, even in taxon, which are not known to be bulbiferous.
Fascinating.
Hi, this is Ben. I
Hi.
had a quick question about, you mentioned pumice in the mix. I'm having great difficulty finding pumice in volume. Any sources?
I have not recently tried to locate any significant amounts, but here in the Bay Area, Richmond soil, American soil and stone in Richmond, or Acapulco soil and stone, and also in Richmond, both of them pretty reliably have horticultural pumice.
Right, thanks.
Any other questions?
Yeah, Mike Mace mentions tree pots. Yeah, the cheap black plastic tree pots that you can get pretty economically. Those are great for Calochortus. I have a friend who grows them in 2 or 3 foot lengths of PVC pipe.
Hmm.
And yeah, Calochortus are great companions for succulents and cycads. They are a constant companion of the Hesperoeucca yucca whipplei, the pale yucca that's all across Central and Southern California. Frequently they snake up between the blades of the Hesperoeucas yuccas. So yeah, they love succulents, cycads, and that kind of substrate.
Do deer eat them? Eat them?
I have never eaten. Oh, do deer eat them? Yes, deer will definitely nibble on them. It's an interesting. I've heard people say that some taxon get heavily browsed and others don't get browsed at all. I don't have a problem with deer in my backyard in Berkeley. So
Thank goodness, huh?
yeah, I have neither gophers nor deer, but I also only have 5,000 square feet. So
Anybody else? Thank you so much. That was really wonderful.
Thank you both.
I will make this. I'll get these slides and put them together. It's all HTML based. So I'll put these up on my own website and send the link out after the show, so people can look at this and
Oh, great.
go through the slides and the images at their leisure.
This is also recorded as well, so it'll be on YouTube.
Yeah.
As well.
So you'll have the recording, but you'll also, if you go to the webpage, you'll be able to see the full resolution images as well. So
Oh, beautiful. Okay. Everyone,
Wonderful.
thanks, Kipp. Anybody can stay on and talk field trips with me?
Mhm.
yeah, I'm still
Yep,
around. Anybody wanted to chat?
I would be interested in either one. I thought the field of Calochortus, I've never seen. You see them isolated here and there, maybe in little patches, but it's much more rare to find a spray like that. So that was down in the Pisces Road or
Road,
whatever.
yeah, down by Hollister, which is a fair drive, but
Fair Drive, yeah.
we can carpool. I'll certainly be going.
Yeah, I would say that is my recommendation. The Berryessa Drive is very nice, and there's lots to see there and lots of interesting taxa, beyond Calochortus. But Pisces is definitely the star of the Calochortus road trips in the area.
Okay, I think
Nice.
I vote for that. Anybody else have any? Maybe you can give us maybe a little hint on. You kind of did on the west side of the Lake Berryessa, but we can just do that on our own or whatever.
Oh yeah.
So how long does it takes a couple hours to,
Well, with this group, who knows how long it might take, depending on what we find on the side of the road.
just to get there? I mean, just to get there.
Yeah. So to get to Hollister is, an hour and a half or so. If you leave early in the morning, you can make good time there. Yeah, and then from Hollister out to sort of the first spot where we might see something to stop for is probably 15 or 20 minutes.
Great.
Okay, are we gonna go to Hollister?
How much walking and what kind of trails or whatever?
So in this case, everything would be very close to the road. I mean, there would be options for walking further from the road, but pretty much everything we'd be seeing would be visible from the road, from parking on the side of the road and just getting out at the car to look.
Okay.
And is there a place for like a picnic for lunch?
We could definitely figure out some spots for that. Yes, I think there's sort of, so depending on where we go. So the Clear Creek Wilderness, you have to get permission to go in, and like I said, there is asbestos in the substrate. But this time of year, it shouldn't be kicking up dust anyway. So we probably don't really have to worry about that too much. And it's a fascinating landscape, and it would allow us to do a loop coming back through Clear Creek, coming out on the southern end of Coalinga Road, and then coming back up 25. So it,
So it's a driving loop.
Yeah. So that would be a driving loop. But there's also a driving loop if you just continue out Piscenes Road all the way to I-5.
Oh.
Yeah. So either one works.
Yeah.
And
Cool.
yeah. So, and that also, the Piscenes trip, some of the nicest stuff to see, it's distributed out. Some of the nicest stuff to see is along the beginning. And there's also the ability, if people don't want to end up going, say, to the Griswold Hills and to Clear Creek, they could diverge off at the Mercy Hot Springs Road and head back towards the Bay Area from there. Which also, Mercy Hot Springs Road also has some nice wildflowers to see as well.
Beautiful. Okay. That sounds like fun to me. Do you want to minimize, do you have a certain amount of people that you want to limit it to, or?
Yeah.
I mean, we can see how many people want to go. I would say anything, 25 people wouldn't be too many.
Okay. That'd be like 6 cars.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Beautiful.
I'm game. Calochortus has been my favorite wildflower for about 30 years. And I just revel every time I see it in the wild. And I've certainly never seen these beautiful sprays of, just a field, a hillside of it.
Yeah, it's pretty unusual. Like this particular spot with the luteus, it's a reliable bloomer year after year. You can see these sort of epic swaths of blooms after fires in places in Central California in the mountains and stuff. But this luteus patch is just it's an agricultural field, and it dries out to basically barren clay during the summer, and so the luteus are.
What are they growing during the winter?
I mean, it's cattle. They're
Oh,
great.
I see. Okay. Oh, cool.
And it is really true that they bury themselves down. I had occasion one time, we were up in the Sierra foothills on my friend's property, and he said, we'll take a few bulbs home. But we were camping and we had no tools. So here I am with a spoon. And after a foot down, I gave up because it was just so much digging. I couldn't believe it. They really get down there.
Yeah. Well, in that case, taking the stem is definitely a good idea. You can just.
I didn't know that. Yeah, I should do that, but haven't been up there for a long time. Great.
Missed opportunity.
Yeah, missed opportunity.
Since Mary brought up that topic of the bulbs moving down, how does that happen?
So Calochortus bulbs, and I think strictly speaking, Calochortus isn't a bulb. It's like, a sort of a stem or something, it's a corm or whatever. But anyway, so each year it grows a new growth node and basically grows the corm at the bottom of that growth node. So, for instance, this year's bulb will put up a bloom stem and it will make the leaf. And then next year's bulb is produced at the bottom, generally speaking, at the bottom of all that. Now, depending on the bulb, so the Albus rubellus that are in my yard seem to be satisfied with their moisture, so they don't try to dig anymore. And so they form their new bulb right around the very bottom of last year's stem. It kind of is clasping it almost. But for ones that I see in the wild that are in drier areas or in pots when I've grown them, harder, the bulb will be completely beneath last year's bulb. The tunic from last year's bulb will be sitting, where it used to sit, and then completely outside of that and underneath it will be the new bulb from this year.
Well, that you would be able to solve the mystery of the weedy allium that we have in the Bay Area, and those bulbs end up being very, very deep, and I've been curious about.
So with allium, they don't work the way that Calochortus do, so they're not producing a brand new bulb every year, but lots of geophytes have contractile roots. So they're basically roots that grow, grip, and then pull the bulb down through the soil.
Thank you.
You're digging almost 2.5 feet to get to the bottom, Kipp, right? When you divide them.
Yeah. So for me, they'll be 5 or 6 inches down because again, my soil has a little bit more moisture. Out in nature, if you were to attempt to dig bulbs out, they are very deep, and frequently they're right between two rocks.
And they
Yes, of
save
course.
themselves from the gophers.
That's
Exactly.
yeah, they do.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
bet.
in the right places, like that field of luteus, in the right places, they can be resistant to rodent pressure, because they can be, vigorous enough to do that. But yeah, in most places, they look for, substrate that a rodent can't burrow into very easily.
All righty. Thanks again for the wonderful talk.
All right, welcome. All right, so it sounds like Piscenes Road is the lead contender, but you can let me know.
Okay, I think that's
Yes.
good.
Sounds great.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Good
Thank you
night.
so much.
Night,
Thank
everybody.
you,
Loved
thank
it.
you.
So here's the save the date. So Saturday, May 25th, I mentioned John Kaplan is opening up his garden. I think it's up in Oakland Hills up in Piedmont, and it has a beautiful garden. He just had is making it's a rock garden. Both Kiamara and Walker are helping him develop it. So that should be fun. And I understand that the Rock Garden Society went last weekend or the weekend before. So I guess the rock garden's
Yeah.
not quite done, but maybe by May it might be. So Mary, do you want to talk about his garden?
Yeah, his garden, he has a lot of elements to the garden. And oddly enough, right by the house, there's these box hedges that I don't think I've seen since I was in Europe. But there's a shaded part of the garden where he's got a lot of begonias growing and shaded by tallish trees. And the rock garden is still pretty rudimentary, but it gives you a sense for how to structure a rock garden. So it's really wonderful. And it's at the very down the hill, very, I think, back of his property. And he's got a lot of, he's got a number of things put in. And he will have, by the time we get there, he will have a lot more put in because Kiamara and Walker Young are both working on it. And there's other sections of the garden. Oh boy, I can't remember what was it. It's very extensive.
It's a big back side of the hill. So he's kind of up there,
Yeah.
and his garden goes kind of downwards with really big, tall trees. And
Yeah.
it's more formal by his house. His house is kind of a formal house, so it kind of suits
Yeah,
the house. And then it
Yeah,
goes
it's very
down to these
bizarre.
crossing paths. And I remember a lot of Redsmansia,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
angels, trumpets, and all different colors. And it's a very personal garden. So he's really involved in
Yeah.
the planting and
He's
design.
very much into the shade garden. And so that's what he primarily works on himself. But once they get the rock garden started, I'm sure he'll be maintaining that.
And then, of course, you heard about the May 26th. So that's Memorial Day weekend. And we got two things going on at once, but we'll get to rest on Monday, excuse me. So we'll have to figure out which field trip we want to go to. And then if you want to host a coffee in the garden, we'd love to go visit people's gardens and get to know everybody. And Cal Hort will bring the coffee and the tea, and then everybody brings a little snack to eat, and we talk about plants and visit someone's garden. So please reach out if you or if somebody'd like to share their garden, that'd be great. And then next month we have Jennifer Jewell, who's written a book about what we sow. So something about gardener and their gardens and why we are involved in gardening and what joy we get out of that. And then she has a award-winning podcast, Cultivating Place. So that is, you can look at that on your podcasts, and that's next month. Good night, and we'll see you next month, and happy gardening.